Good morning. My name is William Porter McRoberts, MD. I am Chief of Pain Medicine and our Neurosurgery Spine Section at Holy Cross Hospital in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And this is a continuation of our Neuromodulation University series, just talking about what is neuromodulation, how can it benefit you, what is it, what are the pitfalls, what are the things to understand and know about it, and how to make choices in this ever-expanding environment of neuromodulation. Neuromodulation, as you know, is spinal cord stimulation. What we're going to focus on today is really three different things which have come out in the past year. They've been, of course, approved in Europe for many years, as is often the case. The first one being high-frequency HF-10K, so high-frequency spinal cord stimulation. The second being dorsal root ganglion stimulation. And then the third being burst stimulation. All three are very different from each other. And as you talk to your physician about what's right and best for you, the choice becomes much more complex because many physicians don't understand the difference. It's all very new to many docs, and it's hard for them to know what is going to suit you the best. This is extremely important because in our environment today, with payers cutting back on reimbursement rates and also the ability to have multiple trials, etc. In Florida, for example, Medicare only allows one trial and one permanent per patient, which is extremely onerous, possibly unethical, but difficult because it puts the onus on us providers to really think through your situation as analytically as possible and come up with a solution that's going to be right the first time, which is even more challenging. What's challenging and also exciting is that all of these have shown to be really quite a bit better than traditional tonic spinal cord stimulation. So we'll start. I had a patient just recently reimplanted, and she implored me to please do a bit on high frequency and why paddle leads in particular are not necessarily needed in high frequency, and we'll certainly cover that. So thank you, Mrs. F. So just starting at the anatomy, the way we're made, if you understand our structure and body, we have a spinal cord. The spinal cord sits inside the spine. The spine is the protective bony architecture that not only houses the spinal cord, which is the pain sensing system and transmission system of sensation and also function and motor down to the legs and arms, but it is also the scaffolding to which much of our skeleton is adhered and all of our muscles of the trunk, etc. So we have the ribs coming in, we have all the muscles lacing up the back part of the spine, and then we have a lot of attachment points for our psoas muscles, a lot of the buttock muscles, etc. all come in and support this structure, which has dual purpose, allowing freedom of movement, allowing stability and strength, and then also housing the main connection, the main wire connecting this to the rest of us. So if you were to peel back the spine and resect it out, you would see literally something that looked very much like this within your spine, which is your spinal cord. And then also, as you can see, nerve roots connecting to the spinal cord. And then this is down at the base of your spine, really about the end of the thoracic spine, the top of your lumbar spine, right about here, which is called your cauda equina and your conus medullaris, the bottom of the spine, and where basically all of the nerves coming from your genitals, legs, etc. come in and intersect right here. What's important about this anatomy is that we're trying to stimulate the sensory nerves, which are coming from your painful areas, on the way to the brain, but not stimulate the motor nerves coming from your brain going to your muscles. So we have specific audiences that we want to stimulate, but not necessarily stimulate them too much or too little, and we don't necessarily want to stimulate the motor nerves. So there are particular pockets that are particularly well suited to this stimulation. So if you look at the way we're organized, the spinal cord and the nerves coming in, most of the nerves coming in have a mixed nerve. They are both motor and sensory until they pass through what's called the foramen, or the hole or window, inside, right at the side of the spine, where the nerve comes in, and right at that point it separates into almost all motor and almost all sensory nerve, leaving something called the DRG, or dorsal root ganglion, which is this red dot, exposed. And it is a almost sensory completely audience, which was unappreciated up until several years ago, when some great minds came up with the concept, we need to look at that as a possible target. And so thus, dorsal ganglion was created, this stimulation protocol, and special leads to place the stimulation just on that audience. On the back side of the cord, it just so happens that the good Lord made it so that the top of the spinal cord, which is kind of like an apple here, if you think about it, is almost all sensory. And the front part, which is harder for us to get to, is luckily almost all motor. There are a lot of different things running along the sides, such as our conduction of bowel habits, bowel and bladder, ejaculation, sweating, these kinds of things, and other proprioceptive moves, etc., seem to feather out towards the side. And the frank, just dorsal columns, we call them, are principally sensory only. The problem with traditional spinal cord stimulation is that the way we're organized, and I drew it out here, is that the fibers that come in from the back generally come into the side and then they go deep. And that's tough for traditional spinal cord stimulation to do, because traditional spinal cord stimulation really stimulates just the skin of the apple. It doesn't go very deep at all. And we've been aware of this, and so we've tried all kinds of tricks throughout the years to stimulate as deep as we can without stimulating these fibers. And what's interesting is that these fibers that are coming in from, say, T11 and T12, they're thick fibers. And the problem with stimulation is that we preferentially, it's just the way we're designed, thick nerves get stimulated way before thin, tiny nerves. And it's the thin, tiny nerves we want to stimulate, sadly. So as soon as we put in an electrode here, and the field comes out like this, we immediately capture those nerves coming in from the ribs, etc., and it becomes painful. If we move more towards the midline, it becomes more likely we're going to stimulate these, but these are more leg nerves coming in here. And that's why it's generally easy to get the legs, but generally harder to get the back. And sadly, a lot of people have back pain, and back pain worse than leg pain, which has been a frustrating component of neuromodulation for literally decades. So we've tried all kinds of tricks. The first was to make a tripole, or to put one lead in the middle and maybe another lead out here. Turn these, okay, in a way that we basically guard those, we hyperpolarize, and we put a current through that protects those entering fibers, and yet drive the current as deep as we can, but it's still quite limited. Efforts to make that even more profound were something called the pentalead, okay, which is a paddle lead, a multi-column paddle, which really had 5 contacts across. And what we would do is we would put an anode and hyperpolarize the entering nerve roots on the side, but then try and really depolarize the center fibers, which were mostly back. That was a good attempt. It did improve outcomes somewhat, but just marginally. Plus, the problem with the paddle is it involved a laminotomy. You had to take out a piece of bone. You had to have a neurosurgeon do it. And so it was somewhat of a challenge. And neurosurgically, you would also, in order to remove it, you'd have to have another surgery. As opposed to, say, percutaneously, which is just like a thin spaghetti, you could just make an incision and pull these out very easily. You don't have to cut bone to do so. And that's one of the promises always of neuromodulation, that's a reversible technology. So I was all a little confounded about putting in a paddle lead. Simply it obfuscates that promise that it's reversible. It's not. You have to scramble the egg somewhat in order to put it in and to take it out. Nevertheless, if the effects were profoundly better, it was often worth it. So that was the concept about how to stimulate the back without getting too much leg or too much rib. It was focused on trying to hyperpolarize these entering fibers as they come in, say up here, placing the leads traditionally, in this area. And you'd have these leads, these nerves coming in, motor as well as sensory, and you'd capture them first. So to try and alleviate that problem, the concept of high frequency was born. And high frequency is a different kind of stimulation. What we have is it's called a chronaxy, and it is a neurophysiologic curve on which you have pulse amplitude and then duration. Okay, so the pulse width and the amplitude. And if we cross this, then we have paresthesia. If we have either more pulse width or more amplitude, you'll develop a paresthesia, which is the tingling. However, if you drive much closer to the vertical axis, for example, and you have a very narrow pulse width but a high amplitude, you would also not feel it very well. And then quite conversely, if you have a very high amplitude, or a very narrow pulse width, very wide pulse width, but low amplitude, it's also hard to feel. You don't feel it. So if we could create a paresthesia, or a stimulation rather, that sat in either one of these peripheries, you would not feel it. So that was the concept, moving from something like 50 to 100 hertz, which is our normal tonic spinal cord stimulator, up to 10,000 hertz, which basically increased the pulse width very, very small, but increased the amplitude, and thus generated a type of response, neurologic response, dumping lots of energy in, but yet not feeling paresthesia. When you don't feel paresthesia, you don't feel any painful recruitment of the ribs, etc. And thus, you don't need a paddle, and you can put the leads in a certain spot. Now, when that was first tried, it was assumed that we would feel paresthesia, that patients would feel it. And when they first tried it on patients, they were surprised, thinking the system wasn't working when they didn't feel it. They actually found it really by accident, the fact that it was paresthesia-free. But patients reported tremendous pain relief, and they knew they were onto something because that kept happening. They found over the years of development of this in Europe, and then also with the Senza RCT trial here in the US that was performed, finishing up about a couple years ago. They found that a certain spot was a sweet spot within the cord, and that spot really was at the T910 disc space, somewhere above the conus, but right, say in here, for example, where all these nerves inside the cord converge, kind of like where a tennis racket, you find a sweet spot. If you hit it right there, the ball goes much further than, say, if you hit it on the outside. And they found if they stimulated right there, placing the leads double overlapping that spot, they had a profound and dramatic result of decrement in pain, but without any feeling of tingling, and because there's no tingling, no change in body position, and no big issues with stimulating the ribs, etc. You could then drive, etc. And it was a profound effect. They studied this prospectively in the Senza RCT trial and found literally it was twice as good as traditional spinal cord stimulation. About 80% of people getting up to 80% pain relief, which is pretty profound. That's available online. You can go to the Nevro spinal cord stimulator website and check it out. It is now FDA approved. So that's the concept behind Nevro. And does it work? It really does work. It's a wonderful product. So, concomitantly, while those Nevro guys were working on their science, these guys at Spinal Modulation were thinking about the dorsal root ganglion, thinking, if we just do tonic spinal cord stimulation on the dorsal root ganglion, maybe we can have similar results, which is sensory without motor, and also profound relief. Plus, they also knew that this DRG, which is really like the brain of a sensory nerve. All those little fibers come in from the periphery in a particular dermatome, and then they come up and they come to the brain of the dorsal ganglion, which is where the nucleus is for all of these long neurons going out to your fingertips, toes, wherever, genitals, anywhere. And they summate here, and then they project down to what we call the T-junction. Okay, and then they send that conduction right up to the cord, and then up to the cord and on up to the brain, and that's how you feel pain. So I said, well, maybe we can make a lead that goes over the dorsal root ganglion, and we'll put a few electrodes on this, and we can stimulate the dorsal root ganglion. And they did it. They first did it in animals. They found profound reduction in pain, and then they did it in human beings, and they had the same. What was particularly dramatic was two things. One, not only do you get dramatic pain relief really in a very specific dermatome, and we were lucky enough to have one of the trial sites here in the US for the dorsal ganglion stimulation prospective trial. We found that you could really dial it into extremely specific areas. If you had pain in your big toe, you could stimulate only the big toe. Inside the knee, top of the knee, outside of the knee, back of the knee, extremely profoundly culturable stimulation, which was great because not everyone wants to have that entire buzzing lower extremity or both or back or everything. They want specificity. And in a large subset of those patients, they also did not have any paresthesia, which was interesting. They could get so close because there's no cerebral spinal fluid in where the dorsal ganglion sits, in the foramen, that you get very, very close, do a whole lot of work without having a whole lot of paresthesia, and also very, very low amplitude. So you could stimulate with low amplitude and not a lot of power, and you could actually have profound effect. What was additionally interesting was that they found really through this process that there was a rich interneuron structure, so that if you wanted to stimulate, say, L4, okay, and you couldn't get into L4 because the foramen was tight, you could really go to L3. And since there's so much connectivity back and forth between L3 and L4, for example, if you stimulated L3, you get profound results in L4, which was not expected, and really only explained by this interneural connection. And the concept was, what you do is you close down this hyperreactive DRG, which is if you send a sensory recording electrode, a very thin needle in, and you listen electrically to this dorsal ganglion, someone who has chronic pain, it is speaking out of turn. It's like a wild child in the classroom, not quiet and obeying orders like the other kids. So if you listen to it and then you stimulate it, you suppress all that aberrant activity down to normal. And when you do it, you actually have a return of normal sensation additionally. That's being studied in Germany and also in Austria, with a couple of researchers who are trying to see how do we actually return this inappropriately behaving dorsal ganglion to normal activity with dorsal ganglion stimulation. So it had profound results, and in the RCT, we found really about 93% of people saying it had a profound effect on them, which is much better than the 50% of people getting about 50% pain relief. It totally broke that previous level of response. So we still don't understand how we can do this, say in the thoracic spine, even in the cervical spine. They're doing this in Europe with profound results. But for things like post-hernorrhapy neuralgia, it's probably going to be very good. It was studied here in the US and is approved for chronic regional pain syndrome, type 1 and 2, had great results. But things like ilioinguinal neuralgia, for example, or testicular pain, or big toe pain, or possibly even peripheral neuropathy, these are all hopeful things. Or say a botched carpal tunnel job, for example, you could put it in the neck and stimulate just, say, the C7 and C6 nerves going to that part of your hand, and just be very specific about it without stimulating any muscle. We're still really on the precipice of understanding great things about DRG, but what we know now is incredibly promising. Those long-term results are still coming out from the study, even though it is also FDA approved. That brings us to BURST. This is not FDA approved yet. What is it? BURST is the concept by Dirk de Ridder, who is a very sensitive and interesting neuroscientist who I've met and actually in Barcelona, where he had much of his concepts come forth. Going to the cathedral built by Gaudi, he found that the best way to interact with nature is to mimic nature, which is an extremely Zen and Taoist concept. But he found that it really has real-world applications. And when he built the cathedral, he found that if you mimic nature, it not only conformed to the surroundings of the town, the city, it also conformed to our innate understanding within us in our appreciation of nature, and architecture should mimic nature ultimately. He did a lot of things looking at gravity and how the different structures should mimic nature. And if you've ever been to that cathedral, you'll understand exactly his interests, even though they were 150 years ago almost. Well, Dirk de Ridder, being a student of Gaudi, thought to investigate the brain and the way the neural axis works in much the same way. And much of his work was in tinnitus. And he found that the thalamus and other portions of the brain would talk to each other in burst. And that was really the language of neurochemistry, that it wasn't just on, off, like we have our lights on, a square, a wave, etc. He found that we communicated between structures in the brain, not just neurons, but structures in burst activity. And we were able to decode that information based on burst. So he said, why don't we stimulate in burst? It's something we can do. And so he came up with a concept of, instead of just having on, off, etc., to give a burst, an almost imperceptible burst followed by silence, and then another imperceptible burst followed by silence. And his study, his initial research, looked at people who already had spinal cord stimulators in them, but for some reason or another was failing the therapy. It wasn't working as well as it had been. And he simply changed, with their permission, the way from this to this. And he changed and acculturated the burst number as well as the burst frequency, the burst specifics, all down to mimic normal electrophysiology. And what he found, basically an observation, is that the patients who were dissatisfied, the gross majority of them became now not only mostly paresthesia free without the stimulation feeling, but also it recaptured their pain relief and they were profoundly better. Not everybody, but a very significant portion of them. So he also found, as he investigated further and asked some questions, that certain other aspects of pain seemed to melt away. And we know pain is a function of the brain. It's not just I hurt there. It is turbated and changed throughout the neural axis as it is processed by not only the peripheral nerves, the dorsal ganglion, the spinal cord, what we call the wide dynamic range on, which is basically the traffic cop for sensation, but then even in the thalamus, where we have a profound processing, which is really at just the top of the brainstem, before we then summate what we feel temporally. And what I mean by that is we don't just hurt. We feel sorrow and loss of hope and despair and frustration and anger and anxiety. And all of these things are built into the experience of pain. But what de Ridder found is that as he changed to this more physiologic pattern, some of those other things that are associated with pain also seem to melt away. The anxiety, the frustration, the rumination, all these other things that drive us crazy as opposed to just hurting also seem to be suppressed as well. That hasn't been studied as robustly yet, but those effects were profound in those studies. And so that is the hope behind burst. While it might not be as just out of the box, maybe quite as efficacious as, say, HF-10 or DRG, there are profound effects that we'll probably need to really study with nuance. And there may be patients who suffer in much a different way and actually have a more suffering component than a painful component. And we may find it has much more profound effects on that experience of pain. So these are things that are talked about, bandied about in neuromodulation. There are three things that I'm extremely excited about because they are simply much more profoundly efficacious tools in the toolbox for treating pain. Hopefully you can see this. There's a little glare, I think, as I was looking. But, and I hope this helps you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I love talking to patients and trying to guide patients towards the best therapy. And really, in my opinion, having a thorough understanding of what the patient is made up of. What are their anxieties? What are the things that are keeping them from being a whole person? And I think if you understand those things, then you're much more capable of really providing something that's going to be a profound impact on them. And you may say, you know what, DRG is the way to go. You may say high frequency is the way to go. You may say burst is the way to go. And in time to come, we may find that if we burst the DRG, for example, you get a different effect, which is extremely exciting. Anytime we take patients' pain away, it is, in my opinion, it's like being Santa Claus. So, and it's a wonderful feeling. So talk about this with your pain doc. Push them a little bit. The pain docs I know are really very, very interested in you and really making you much better. I think there's a lot of fuzz, some of it from industry, and I think we got to look through that. As much as I love the industry, we wouldn't be doing any of this without them. There is an incentive, of course, to sell a product, and if they don't keep the doors open, then nothing will be forthcoming. But the onus is on us as doctors, the onus is on you as a patient to really think about things as profoundly and deeply as possible. Understand it, look at the basic science, and hopefully make the right choice. I appreciate your attention, and please look for other videos. Thank you.